It was the winter of 1946, and the city of Frankfurt lay in ruins. Smoke still lingered over the collapsed rooftops, the cold air heavy with the scent of ash and damp brick. Hunger moved like a ghost through the streets, silent, invisible, relentless. And somewhere in that ghostly silence, a 12-year-old boy named Emil Hartmann ran through the back alleys, clutching something precious and forbidden in his small hands. It was half a loaf of white bread, still warm from the ovens of the American supply depot. The crust crackled faintly in the freezing air, steam rising from it like a secret. Emil's heart hammered against his ribs as he darted through the rubble. His breath came in short bursts that clouded in front of him. Behind him a shout, low, sharp, foreign, an American voice. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, slicing across the walls and catching the corner of his sleeve. He froze, the beam swung back, and suddenly he was bathed in light. He couldn't see the man's face, just the hard outline of a soldier's uniform, the glint of metal from the rifle slung across his back. The bread pressed against Emil's chest like stolen gold. In that frozen moment, he thought of his older brother's warning. They will shoot you for less than that. Emil, for an apple, for a potato, shoot first. Ask later, but his mother hadn't eaten in 3 days. His little sister's belly was bloated from hunger, her small frame trembling every night as she cried herself to sleep. There were no choices left, only survival. The soldier stepped closer, boots crunching on the frost. Emil tried to move, but his legs refused. The man's voice came again, harsh and foreign, words he couldn't understand. Then the soldier crouched, his flashlight lowering. For a brief moment, Emil saw his face, a young man, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that looked older than he should have been. The soldier didn't raise his weapon. He didn't shout for backup. He just looked at the boy and then at the bread. "You hungry?" he asked, his German thick and broken. Emil nodded. The man reached out. Emil flinched, bracing for the blow, but it never came. Instead, the soldier gently broke the loaf in half. He handed one piece back to Emil, then pointed toward the depot door. "Tomorrow morning," he said slowly. "You come work." Emil stared at him, speechless. He couldn't tell if it was mercy or a cruel trap. But before he could ask, the soldier had already turned away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the depot. At the doorway, the man turned once more and said a single word that would echo in Emil's memory for the rest of his life. Promise. That night, in a small corner of a crumbling apartment building where 3 families shared one room, Emil divided the bread into careful portions, one piece for his mother, one for his sister, one for himself. The others watched but didn't ask where it came from. The crust was soft, the taste real. It had been months since he'd eaten anything made with proper flour. Still, the words haunted him. "Tomorrow you come work." By morning the bread was gone and the gnawing emptiness returned. Emil sat in the cold, listening to his sister's weak crying. He thought about the soldier's face, those eyes not angry but tired, sad even. When he'd been younger, before the bombs, before his father died in the firestorm that leveled half the city, Emil had been told that the Americans were monsters. At the youth meetings, their instructor had shown them posters, grotesque drawings of men in foreign uniforms stealing children, defiling women, burning homes. "This is the enemy," they'd said. "They will show no mercy." But when the Americans came, there had been no screams, just silence. Then the sound of trucks, foreign voices, and the strange sight of soldiers helping civilians pull the wounded from the rubble. It had confused him. He'd expected monsters and found men instead. Still, fear had stayed with him, until that night with the bread. The next morning, Emil walked toward the depot. The sun hadn't yet burned through the mist. The guard at the gate, a red-haired giant with a laugh that shook his whole body, looked down at the small boy hovering in the street. "You lost, kid?" he asked in English. Emil stammered in broken German. "Soldier, yesterday." He said work. The man blinked, then grinned and waved him through. "Kitchen's that way," he said, pointing to a low building on the other side of the yard. Inside, the smell of stew and fresh bread hit him like a memory of childhood. The same soldier from last night stood at a steel counter, peeling vegetables. He looked up and smiled. A real smile. "Oh, came," he said in halting German. "Good, come." Emil didn't move. Every instinct screamed trap. The soldier, his name stitched on his uniform, read Miller, put the knife down on the counter where Emil could see it. Then he picked up an apron from a hook and held it out. You work, you eat. Yes, Emil hesitated. Miller sighed, picked up a potato and began peeling it slowly, exaggerating the motion like a teacher. Peel, rinse, cut. Peel, rinse, cut. Then he pushed the peeler across the table toward Emil. Try. Emil's hands trembled as he took it. He'd peeled potatoes his whole life, but the fear made him clumsy. The blade slipped, slicing his thumb. A drop of blood welled up. He gasped, jerking his hand back. Miller swore softly, moved toward him, then stopped, hands raised, showing he meant no harm. It's okay, he said gently. Let me help. Emil hesitated, then offered his hand. The soldier wrapped it in a clean cloth, pressing just enough to stop the bleeding. His touch was careful, almost fatherly. There, he murmured. Now again, slowly. This time Emil peeled the potato perfectly. Miller nodded, smiling again. Good, very good. For the next hour they worked in silence. Miller didn't ask questions, didn't push conversation. He just worked beside the boy, peeling, chopping, cooking. When noon came, he ladled stew into 2 bowls, rich, thick, filled with meat and vegetables, and set one in front of Emil. Eat, he said simply. Emil tried to hold back, to eat with dignity, but hunger won. He devoured the food, hardly pausing to breathe. Miller said nothing, just slid his own bread across the table when Emil's was gone. When the boy finally looked up, eyes wet, the soldier spoke softly. You have family? Emil nodded. Mother, sister, small. Miller thought for a moment, then went to the storeroom. He returned with a canvas bag and began filling it. A loaf of bread, a tin of meat, a small sack of flour. He handed it to Emil. For your family. Tomorrow you come again. Work, eat, take food home. Emil stared at the bag, stunned. Why? He whispered. Miller's expression changed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, creased photograph. A woman and a young boy smiling in front of a white house. My wife, he said quietly. My son. His name's Tom, same age as your sister. His voice softened. If my boy was hungry, I hoped someone would feed him. Emil felt the sting of tears, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than fear. He clutched the bag to his chest, nodded and whispered, Thank you. Miller smiled. Tomorrow, he repeated. That night, Emil ran home through the bombed streets, the food bouncing against his side. His mother's eyes filled with tears when she saw the flour, the bread, the tin of meat. She held him tightly, whispering prayers of thanks he barely understood. For the first time in months, the room smelled of something like hope. He went back the next day. And the next after that. At first, he still expected it all to fall apart, that one morning soldiers would be waiting to punish him for daring to trust. But every day was the same, work, food, kindness. Miller even began teaching him words in English, laughing at his pronunciation. Potato, he'd say, pointing. I say potato. Emil would try and butcher it. Miller would laugh again. Close enough. Days turned into weeks. The boy who had once been afraid to speak now asked questions. How to cook, how to measure, how to say things in English. Miller always answered patiently, sometimes with gestures, sometimes with laughter. But one afternoon, the rhythm of their small world shattered. A sergeant burst through the kitchen door, his face red, voice raised. Emil didn't understand the words, but he could hear the anger. The man pointed at him, shouting in English. Miller stood between them, answering in a tone that matched the sergeant's volume. They argued, hands flying, faces tight. Finally, the sergeant threw his hands up and left, slamming the door behind him. Emil stood frozen, certain his time was up. Miller turned to him, breathing hard. You okay? He asked. Then, searching for the words in German, he said, He says rules. I say, no, you stay. You work, okay? You fought for me, Emil whispered. Miller looked at him, surprised. Then he smiled faintly. Of course. You're a good worker. Good boy. Something inside Emil cracked. Something built on years of fear and hate and propaganda. This man, this American soldier he had once believed was a monster, had risked punishment for him. In that moment, for the first time since the war began, Emil felt safe. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of yeast and onions. Sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air. Emil stood at his usual spot by the counter, sleeves rolled up, his fingers moving with growing confidence. He no longer flinched every time Miller moved. He no longer glanced at the door, expecting soldiers to storm in. The kitchen had become a small island of safety, in a city drowning in ruin. Outside, Frankfurt was still a skeleton. Streets once filled with trams and laughter were now rivers of rubble. Men with hollow eyes traded heirlooms for food. Women queued for hours at relief stations, their ration cards worn thin. But inside the depot kitchen, Emil found something fragile and impossible, a sense of normal. Sometimes, Miller would hum while he worked, old American tunes Emil didn't know, but their rhythm was comforting. Other times he'd talk about home, about Kentucky, about green fields and a river called the Ohio. "I teach my boy to fish," he'd say proudly, miming the cast of a fishing rod. Emil would laugh, imagining this soldier, so serious in his uniform, sitting by a riverbank with a child. Bit by bit, Miller taught him English words. Emil would repeat them awkwardly, rolling them around his tongue as though tasting something new. Bread, knife, friend. Miller's German improved too, though he often mixed up words, turning simple sentences into jokes that made them both laugh. For a while, that laughter was enough to drown out the ghosts. But the city outside didn't forgive easily. One grey morning, as Emil walked to the depot, a group of older boys, former members of the youth corps, blocked his way. Their coats were torn, their faces thin, but their eyes still burned with pride and resentment. "Traitor," one hissed. "You work for the Americans? For the pigs who bombed us?" Emil said nothing, clutching the strap of his bag tighter. Another boy shoved him. "You begged them for food like a dog?" He wanted to shout that it wasn't like that he earned what he took home, that Miller wasn't cruel. But his throat closed. He just ran. When he reached the kitchen, Miller saw the bruise forming on his cheek. He frowned, tilting the boy's chin gently toward the light. "Who did this?" Emil hesitated. "German boys, they say—" "I betray," Miller sighed. "No, they wrong." He knelt so their eyes met. "Listen, war's over. You do not betray. You survive. You help family. That is brave." His German was broken, but the meaning was whole. Emil nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "People angry now," Miller continued softly. "They lost much, but anger not feed them. Hate not build homes. Only work, only kindness. We build again, yeah?" "Yes," Emil whispered. That night, when he told his mother what happened, she placed a hand on his head. "He's right," she said. "Those boys have only anger left. Don't let it grow inside you." The next weeks passed quietly. Emil worked, studied, and learned. Sometimes Miller's friends would join them for meals. They teased each other, joked about home, even taught Emil to shuffle a deck of cards. To his surprise, he began to feel something he hadn't in years: belonging. But one afternoon in late spring, the world shifted again. A letter arrived for Miller. Emil found him sitting at the counter, staring at it. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Bad news?" Emil asked. Miller shook his head slowly. "No good, I go home soon." He tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "Back to my wife." "My boy." Emil's stomach twisted. "When?" "Maybe 2 weeks." He nodded, pretending not to care, pretending that it didn't feel like the floor was giving way beneath him. 2 weeks. After that, the kitchen would be just another cold room again. The next day, Miller brought him something. A folded paper, thick and carefully written. "Letter for you," he said. "Recommendation?" "For school." "School?" Emil echoed, confused. "Yes, I talk with officer." "You smart boy. You go learn." "No kitchen forever. Future, Emil." For a long time, the boy said nothing. The word future felt foreign on his tongue. He'd lived too long in survival mode to imagine anything beyond tomorrow. That night, he told his mother. She wept silently, then smiled. "He's giving you a chance, Emil, take it." When Miller met her the next morning, she came dressed in her cleanest clothes. Her German was formal, rehearsed, but her gratitude was raw. "You saved my son," she said softly. Miller shook his head. "He saved himself, I only—" "Help." He handed her a bag filled with food. Sugar, flour, coffee, more than they'd seen in months. She tried to refuse, but he pressed it into her hands. "No pay," he said gently. "He work, he eat." "That's fair." For a moment no one spoke. Then she did something that startled them both. She took his hand and kissed it. Miller froze, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for seeing my boy as a human." When they left, Emile walked beside her in silence. She looked at him and said, "Remember this. When people tell you to hate someone you've never met, they are lying. You must decide for yourself who deserves your kindness." He nodded. The following week, Miller and Emile worked side by side for the last time. The kitchen felt heavier than usual. The air was filled with things unsaid. At the end of the day, Miller cleaned his station slowly, almost ceremonially. He turned to Emile and said, "Tomorrow I go home, but you stay strong. You learn. You build." Emile wanted to say something, anything, but words failed. He simply reached out his hand. Miller shook it firmly, the same way he had with Emile's mother. Between equals. When Miller left the next morning, he carried only a small bag, his photograph, and a folded letter in his breast pocket. He turned once at the depot gate, raised a hand, and smiled. Emile waved back until the soldier disappeared into the mist. That was the day the boy stopped waiting for miracles and started becoming one. He went to school in the afternoons and worked odd jobs in the mornings. He studied electrical circuits and mathematics, learned English with the determination of someone who had once known what it felt like to have no voice. He sent his first letter to Miller in 1951. In careful English, he wrote, "I finished my studies. I have a job now. My mother sews again. My sister goes to school. We are alive because you were kind." 3 months later, a reply came from Kentucky. Miller's handwriting was shaky, but the joy in his words was unmistakable. "I told my boy about you. He says when he grows up, he wants to be like the man who fed him." Enclosed was a photograph. Miller, older now, with his son, both smiling wide. Years passed. Letters crossed the ocean like small bridges between two lives that might never have touched otherwise. Emile grew into a man. He married, had children of his own, built power lines across the rebuilt Frankfurt skyline. But in his heart, he still carried the warmth of that kitchen, the sound of laughter over a pot of stew, and the memory of a soldier who had chosen mercy over punishment. One day, decades later, he received another letter, this one not from Miller, but from his son Tom. It was short, written in elegant handwriting. "My father passed away last week. He kept all your letters. He often said you were the proof that one small act can last a lifetime. Thank you for being his friend." Emile sat in silence, the paper trembling in his hands. Outside, the city lights flickered, electric, alive, the product of everything he had helped rebuild. He whispered softly, "Thank you, Jack," as if the man could still hear him across the ocean. Years went by the way winter turns to spring without asking permission, and the boy who had once run through alleys with a stolen loaf became the man who timed the hum of transformers and traced the quiet logic of cables across a city that had learned to breathe again. He married a woman who loved to read by the window and who laughed at the way he measured coffee with engineer's precision. They had 2 daughters who treated the rebuilt tramlines like silver threads on a map they were writing with their own footsteps. Every so often, a letter from Kentucky arrived with a familiar handwriting that grew slightly thinner over the decades, but the voice inside it never changed. "How are you? Are you well? Tell me what you are building now. I am proud of you." And sometimes a photograph would slide out, as if the envelope itself could not carry all the distance without passing along some small proof of life. A birthday cake with leaning candles, a boy at a baseball field named Tom who became Thomas and then simply Tom again, now tall enough to cast his father in shadow during late afternoon pictures that still captured the old soldier's smile. Emile kept each page in a wooden box he had sanded himself. On hard days when the city felt too loud or the stations too bright, he would lift the lid and sit with the letters in his lap like a lantern that remembered how the dark once sounded. He would reread the first one and feel everything return, the steam of winter breath in the alley, a cloth pressed to a cut thumb, a hand raised halfway in caution and then lowered in trust. A door opening where there should have been a wall. In the summer of 1989, when the world seemed to be unbuttoning itself and new air coming through the gaps, Emile took those letters and crossed the ocean. He brought his daughters because he wanted them to see the country that had once been all thunder in the sky, and then became something else in a kitchen with chipped enamel bowls. He stepped onto American soil and realized it smelled like nothing he could name, just its own weather, its own mood. At the airport in Louisville, a middle-aged man he recognized only from photos waved a hand high above the crowd. The years vanished when they hugged. The soldier, who had been younger than war should allow, was now grey at the temples, his shoulders softer, his eyes still bright as if the soul behind them hadn't surrendered an inch. "Look at you," Miller said, holding him by the arms to get a full view, as if the most honest way to measure time was to simply stand in front of it. "Look what you did with the second chance." They drove past rolling green that went on like a promise nobody had decided to break. The Ohio River moved with the lazy certainty of a thing that knew its destination regardless of human plans. At the house, Miller's wife, Eliza, was waiting on the porch with a dish towel thrown over her shoulder, and a smile so kind it made the distance between countries feel like a misunderstanding. Tom arrived soon after, taller than his father, his handshake firm, a bit shy at the corners of his grin. In the kitchen, the old soldier stirred a pot, and the smell lifted Emil backward through time in a way that did not hurt. It was the same stew, thick and generous, the same bread set on the table with a knife beside it, like a small ceremony that did not need a priest. They ate together and told stories where everyone took turns being both student and teacher. The daughters asked careful questions in English that moved through the room like a bridge lowering itself into place. When the night grew warm and the cicadas took the windows for their choir loft, Emil and Miller sat out back with coffee gone cold, saying nothing for a while simply because the world did not require words to admit that it had been harsh and confusing and sometimes miraculously tender. "There's a thing I've told Tom," Miller said finally, his voice easy with the weight of saying something true. "Kindness isn't a soft thing. It's not weak. It costs something real," Emil nodded. "It cost you your certainty that night. Maybe your safety." "It bought me my humanity back," Miller replied. "That was the bargain." The next morning, Miller laid a folded paper on the kitchen table. It was the letter of recommendation he'd written decades before, the pages worn soft at the creases from being opened and closed in the kind of faith a person carries without needing to name it. "I kept a copy," he said, a little sheepish, as if confession had settled on him with the dust. "I'd like to remember the day I got to put my name behind yours." Emil took the paper and smoothed it with careful fingers, feeling the indent of old ink, as if you could touch a choice that had once been made and feel its pulse. "You gave me this when I had nothing that looked like a road," he said. "It turned the ground into something I could walk." They went to the river that afternoon with Tom, who had brought a pair of fishing rods and a bag of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, explaining in a slow, patient voice the way a father does when he wants to give away his favorite skill. The water slid by like a secret that wasn't trying very hard to stay hidden. When the line bobbed, Tom's face lit up, and Miller laughed the same laugh he used to use when Emil mispronounced potato. The catch was small and quickly freed, but the moment was bigger than breath, and it hung there a long while after the ripples forgot they had been called. In the evening, they found old photographs. Here was the young soldier with hair too dark for the desert of age. Here the boy at a kitchen counter with a peeler. Here the woman on the porch and the toddler with jam on his face. They mapped a life with images the way you lay down cables across a city and believe the lights will follow. When they said goodbye at the airport, there was no drama, just the same handshake they had given each other the day before the war decided to return him home. Between equals, between friends, between two people who understood that gratitude, like electricity, keeps working whether or not you see it. The letter about Miller's death arrived 4 years later, on a grey day that had already been stingy with its sun. Emil unfolded the paper at his kitchen table and read that his friend had been buried under a sky with no clouds, by a church near the river. Tom wrote that the service had been simple, honest, and that there had been too much food, because that is what you do in grief. You cook for an absence as if it might sit at the table one more time. Emil pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes and felt the kind of ache that makes the past and present hold hands too tightly. He booked a flight, packed the letters, and crossed the ocean again. He stood at the front of the small church in Kentucky, where the wood had been polished by decades of hands, and looked out at faces he did not know but recognized anyway. He told them a story about a night in a city that once believed it had run out of grace. He told them about a soldier who put down his knife before he put down a boy's fear, about a piece of bread that became a bridge between enemy and family, about the way a single choice can hold back a tide you were taught could not be stopped. He did not make of it a sermon. He made of it a thank you that had been traveling across time to find a place to land. Afterward, in the shadow of oaks that wore their shade like a patient promise, Tom embraced him. "He talked about you a lot," he said into Emil's shoulder, voice uneven at the edges. Not as a miracle he performed, as a miracle that happened to him. Emil returned to Frankfurt with a program from the service tucked into his jacket pocket, the paper thin as a page from a story you cannot put back on the shelf. He kept working. He taught younger engineers how to treat a map of a neighborhood as if it were a living thing, and not a set of lines that could be ignored. He liked to stand beneath the streetlights at dusk, just as they hummed alive, and he would imagine the way the current ran from house to house, like a rumor about hope that turned out to be true. When he retired, schools began inviting him to speak, because history has an appetite for first-person verbs. He would stand in front of classrooms where children had only met war through photographs and ask them to imagine a city that smelled like burning stone and wet wool, to imagine a sister who cried herself to sleep, a mother who learned how to make courage sound ordinary, a boy who had been told that monsters wore an enemy's uniform, but then met a young man who wore that same uniform and put on kindness instead. He would tell them that slogans are easy and mercy is difficult, and that one of these things fixes the world while the other simply poisons it more slowly. He would say, "Do not be impressed by a voice that shouts. Be impressed by a hand that helps." He would say, "You can waste a lifetime looking for a moment big enough to matter, or you can save a lifetime by choosing a small one on purpose." His daughters grew into women who loved music and books, and the particular way their father's face softened when he saw a stranger struggling with a heavy bag. They learned the pattern of his tenderness, the way you learn a city's tram schedule, by living inside it until it becomes second nature. They married, had children of their own, and sometimes asked him to tell the story again at dinner when the candles were short and the food stretched farther than it needed to. He did not make himself the hero. He told it the way it was, a starving child, a soldier very far from home, and a door that opened on a word called promise. On his desk, where once blueprints and voltage charts had crowded out empty space, he kept the wooden box that held every letter from across the Atlantic. He added the funeral program and the old recommendation to the pile, and beneath the lid he placed a photograph he had taken from Miller's refrigerator with Eliza's blessing, a picture of Tom at 7 years old with a toy boat at the edge of the river. If anyone asked, Emil would say it calmed him to look at it. Though the truth ran deeper, it reminded him that a gift given in one place has a way of washing up somewhere else and becoming useful there too. In his 80s he moved more slowly, but he did not stop moving. He walked the same streets he had once run, pausing at intersections where new apartments had shouldered out of the ground like carefully planned miracles. He sat on benches and watched the glow of evening arrive on schedule, and sometimes he spoke to the air in a voice meant for one person. "Thank you, Jack. Look what we built. Look at the ordinary kindness taking root where the rubble used to be." In those last years, the City Museum asked if his letters could be part of an exhibit about rebuilding. He said yes, not because he believed his life deserved a glass case, but because he understood that young eyes needed to see proof that history is made from choices, not statues. The curator wore thin gloves and lifted each envelope as if it could break into silence if handled too fast. They set the letters beside photographs and a caption that did not turn the story into something you could buy. Visitors stopped and read. Schoolchildren pressed fingertips to the glass as if they could warm what had once been cold. A teacher would whisper, "Here was a boy who thought the world had only one answer, and here was a man who gave him a different one." When Emil died, the box remained in his desk, and on a page from the recommendation he had carried like a compass, there was a sentence in pencil, written in a careful hand that belonged to someone younger, but was still his. He had written it decades before, and folded it away like a prayer meant to be found at the right time. It said in his own language first, and then in the language that had once been a bridge, "Kindness outlasts hate." The daughters found it, smoothed the paper, and followed their father's wish that the letters belonged to everyone now. They carried the box to the museum and left it in the care of hands that understood what a relay baton feels like. When it presses against your palm and tells you to keep going. There is a particular visit that the museum staff talks about when they remember why they do the work. A boy whose parents had come from somewhere else, A kid who felt the country still deciding if there was a chair for him at the table stood in front of the exhibit longer than the others. He read the letters and then read them again. His teacher came up behind him and said softly, "It's time." The boy pointed to the page where a soldier spoke of a son he hoped would be fed if he were hungry, and the kid's voice shook when he said, "This means I can be the one who helps, right?" The teacher nodded, and the boy straightened his shoulders in a way that made him look taller than a minute before. That has to count as rebuilding too. If you stand in Frankfurt at dusk, the lights hum on one by one. You can watch the line of illumination spread like a quietly told story, house to house, street to street, until the city has a heartbeat you can see. Somewhere a kettle sings, somewhere a child laughs the way children do when they don't yet know that the world could ask too much of them. Somewhere a mother lays a piece of bread on a table, and nobody thinks of the price it cost to carry it this far, because gratitude is often most honest when it doesn't announce itself. And if you pause under a lamp and look up, the glow has the same warmth as a kitchen in 1946, where a young man set down his knife and handed a boy an apron. This is where we arrive after all that distance, not at a speech, not at a monument, but at a door. A person stands on one side of it with something to give. A person stands on the other side with something to lose. The hinge is a decision. The room beyond it is the future. Once you have seen a door opened in a place that should have been locked, you learn how to find the handle in other rooms, other years, other lives. Perhaps there is a corner of your day where this story belongs. Perhaps there is a small kindness you have been carrying in your pocket, like a coin you were not sure you had permission to spend. Spend it. Buy back a moment from the dark. There is a person whose hunger you cannot hear because hunger is quiet. There is a person whose fear you cannot see because fear is shy. There is a person who expects to be pushed away because all the signs told them to prepare for it, and you can be the one who surprises them. Make the phone call. Write the recommendation. Stand in the doorway and say you can work here. Eat first. Take something home. And if this story moved something in you, if it nudged your memory toward the hands that have steadied you or reminded you that mercy is not an abstraction but a muscle, then carry it forward. Share it with someone who needs their idea of the world rearranged the way kitchens rearrange hunger. Tell it to a friend, to your children, to your past self who didn't yet know that strangers could be gentle. Leave a note for the person who will come after you and open the same drawer, the same box, the same folded page. Tell them where to find the handle on the next door. And if you want to keep walking with stories like this, if you want your feed to hold more light than noise, then stay with us. Subscribe so you do not miss the next lantern. Share this with someone who thinks kindness is too small to matter. Leave a comment with the name of the person who opened a door for you, so the rest of us can learn new ways to turn the knob. We build a better world the way engineers wire a city, line by line, block by block, one connection at a time, until the night is lit by ordinary people doing the brave work of being kind.